on that chapter, on everything we just covered. There's some pretty good videos I think I have on the modules that you might want to check out as well. And we're going to take a little bit of time right now to go over the quiz and go over some of the topics and things that you might see on the quiz. And just as a reminder, everyone who's here is going to get 1 point, but you got to hang out till the end so I can get your name written down. All right, so let's see, going back through chapter 1. So I don't remember for sure if I talked about this on the lecture on chapter 1, but I know it's in the book. But you can type the answers if you know it. But who knows there's 4 basic types of mental health workers. So we have like therapists and counselors. We have psychologists and psychiatrists. Which one prescribes medication?
Psychiatrist?
All right, there we go. Psychiatrists are the doctors. They're the medical doctors. They prescribe. Psychologists tend to do the testing, and psychologists do quite a few different things. They don't prescribe, but they do the research at the universities. They also can see clients and patients. Like if I have a patient, I'm a therapist. If I see a patient, maybe I'm trying to figure out if they have a learning disability or maybe they have autism or on the spectrum of autism. So I think they do, but I'm not positive. I might send them to a psychologist to get neuropsych testing to find out for sure. So they do that type of testing. And then they also do clinical therapy as well. Therapists generally are the ones you go to talk out your problems. If you have trauma therapists or marriage, family therapists, or working on anxiety or depression or things like that, the therapists are usually who you go to for that type of treatment. Psychiatrists you go get the pills from, and the psychologists somewhere in between on all that stuff. We talked about some biases in chapter 1 as well. And we talked in chapter 1 was kind of about the scientific method, why we need to have the scientific method in psychology, because it's what they call a soft science. We're talking about emotions and thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and those don't exactly break down nicely into numbers like math and physics does, or chemistry. So we do have to follow a very stringent scientific method in order to get repeatable, valuable results, right? And we always control for biases that we naturally have. And some of the biases we have is like hindsight bias. And that is one of those ones where we look backwards and we like kind of I knew it all along type phenomenon. I knew they were going to break up. I could tell. I just knew. But in reality, what science has shown, what the research has shown, is that we often don't know the future, believe it or not. We often think we might, but we often don't know the future. But after the event happens, a lot of us mysteriously knew it all along. So it's often very inaccurate. But it's a bias that we have. Also, we have overconfidence in ourselves a lot of times, overconfidence in our ability to do things. So we tend to be overconfident. That's another bias. Let's see, another one is kind of validating our own belief system, where we think of where we're trying to prove our own thesis, we're trying to prove our own point. So we pick the information that we like and we discard the information that doesn't fit our schema, and we proceed to go from there. So speaking of the scientific methods, we had 3 main kinds we talked about. Who can name, well, see if we can get 3 of them. What are the 3 main scientific methods? Who can give me one of them? We had, you just started, we had descriptive methods. And we had 2 other ones. Anybody come up with it? All right, so we had descriptive methods, we had correlation, and we had experimentation. So how all three of those kind of fit together is the descriptive methods is basically that we're describing what we see. We're observing, we're describing, and that's about it. So there's kind of the main ones that for descriptive method are case study, where I take one case and describe it in very, very much detail, in case that case appears again somewhere else and someone can say, hey, I saw that somewhere. So that's a case study. Surveys, where we send out a bunch of surveys to people and they fill them out and they send them back, and we get a bunch of data from that. It's self-report, so we take it for what it's worth, but it's self-report, but it gives us an idea of what's going on. We're not really predicting anything, we're just observing still. And we also have a naturalistic observation like Jane Goodall did in the forest with the gorillas, where she went in there and kind of didn't interfere with them, didn't try to do any experiments on them, just watched and observed their behaviors. And that's naturalistic observation. So that's all under the descriptive form of scientific method. The next one is the correlation. I remember the big one with correlation is that it does not cause, or it does not show causation. So just because two things are related doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. And so we got into types of correlation and things like that, but basically just know that causation or correlation does not mean causation. And the third one is experimentation, and this is where we're trying to find or trying to show causation. So we know that these two things are linked, and we think one might cause the other, but we just have a correlation so far, so we don't know. So we have to set up an experiment to find out. See how all this kind of flows together. We observe the environment, observe things that we're interested in. We start to notice patterns, start to see things, start to see, oh, hey, when this happens, this happens. Every time this happens, this happens. I wonder if there's a cause relationship there. Well, let's set up an experiment and find out. So we start with observing, we see the correlation, and we start to experiment. What is that sugar pill called? Excellent. All right. Placebo. And it's for the placebo effect. So when we're in experimentation phase of the scientific method, we're looking at experiments where we set up blind and double blind. And blind and double blind experiments mean that a blind experiment would be the subjects, the people receiving, like, say, antidepressant medication. We're testing the effects of an antidepressant medication, seeing if it works or not. So the subjects, the people that are going to take the medication, and the control group, the ones that are going to get the placebo, they're blind. They don't know which one they're getting. Now, the experiment, me as the experimenter might know. That's just a blind experiment. If I don't know, and we have it all coded out, and someone has the codes in a sealed envelope, so I don't know if you're getting placebo, or I don't know that you're getting the medication. That's called a double-blind experiment, where neither the subject nor the experimenter know, and that kind of helps prevent bias. So I can't give you the actual medication and wink at you and say, oh, good job, right? So I'm not tainting the experiment at all. Then we're getting into chapter 2, and we'll do it on time. So we talked about neurons, and just a quick review of the neurons. We had the neuron, which had the cell body, and around the cell body had the dendrites. Those were the branches going away from the cell body that actually connect to the surrounding neurons. So the surrounding neurons sending signal to the cell, it's their dendrites. The dendrites go to the cell body. It makes the decision whether to fire or not fire based on the intensity of the surrounding cell's mission to fire, signal to fire. When it decides to fire, it's going to send that electrical signal down the axon. That's that long branch. It sends that electrical signal down that long branch, and it hits the axon terminals, where it gets turned from electricity into chemistry, into chemical. And that is a neurochemical that gets released. Neurotransmitter is what that's called. There's lots of them. And that neurotransmitter jumps across the synaptic gap. There's a little gap in between the synapse of the firing neuron and the receiving neuron. There's a little gap there, and it shoots that chemical across there, that neurotransmitter across, and then that chain reaction goes on and on. So know something about that whole process that I just described. Know what the neuron, the components of the neuron is, dendrites, axon, and cell body. Know what neurotransmitters are. One thing I did not hit on very hard, if I remember, is adrenaline. I think everyone has heard of adrenaline, right? That's the adrenaline is the chemical, the neurochemical that gets released from your adrenal glands that sit above your kidneys. Basically, it gets our body ready for fight or flight. It's a whole bunch of energy. We get superhuman strength. We're ready to fight a bear, run away, or do something, right? So it gets our body charged with adrenaline. Um, However, due to copyright reasons, we're not calling it adrenaline in America. We call it ephedrine. Um, I'm sorry, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are also they're adrenaline. They're adrenaline and noradrenaline. Those are two of the chemicals that are released, hormones that are released from your adrenal glands. So just know that epinephrine is adrenaline. Epinephrine is adrenaline. There is a copyright thing there. The adrenaline was first copyrighted in I think it was in the United Kingdom. And so because of that, we had to come up with a different term, which is dumb. But just so you know that the answer on the question, epinephrine is the same as adrenaline. And let's see. Anybody remember? This is maybe a tougher question, but there was a band. There's two bands. One band though that goes from ear to ear over the top was the motor cortex, and then there was also the somatosensory motor cortex or somatosensory cortex, which was another band that goes across right next to it. The motor cortex is basically when they poke it, a part of your body will actually move. That's the motor part. So it's hitting your motor neurons and telling your body to move. So you poke this side of my motor cortex and maybe my right arm moves because remember there's a cross wiring that happens in our body. So you poke this side of my motor cortex and maybe my left foot moves. Now on the somatosensory cortex, the other band, you poke that one and maybe I'll feel something on my shoulder. You poke it on this side, maybe I'll feel something on my leg. So that's where the information is coming up to my brain and I sense something, I feel something. One is for sensing, that's the somatosensory cortex, and the other is for moving, the motor cortex. We talked about some of the different parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is developing up until you're about 25. And that's in charge of our ability to foresee consequences, to plan, to judge. That's why teenagers and children have notoriously poor judgment because that part of their brain has not fully developed yet. So they're not able to see forward well enough to see the consequences of actions a lot of times, or they don't have the development to care about those consequences as much as maybe they should. So that's what's happening in the prefrontal cortex. It's also a lot of where our personality comes from as well, because it helps monitor and dampen some of the emotional responses that come from the amygdala deeper in the brain. Then we also looked at the left and right hemisphere of the brain. So we have the brain developed and has two left and a right hemisphere, right? So you can usually see that split down the middle. And the left hemisphere, who can name a characteristic of the left hemisphere offhand? There's 4 L's. Anybody remember any of the 4 L's? We had literal, we had language. Oh, we got someone.